Hey guys, my name is Toby and welcome back to another very exciting Photoshop tutorial where today we're going to be taking a look at working with RAW files. Now, if you're not familiar with what a RAW file is, you've probably seen the option on the back of your camera to shoot in either JPEG or RAW. And there are some major benefits to shooting in RAW. What normally happens when you take a picture is the camera will capture all of the information in the scene, more than you probably realize it's actually capturing. Then, depending on kind of what you've got set in your camera, it will apply various amounts of contrast or saturation and sharpening and that kind of thing to the picture. Then, the camera will kind of analyze what it's got, and any information that it doesn't really need, it will throw away, and then it will kind of compress your JPEG file and you end up with your final picture. Now, when you shoot a RAW file, the camera will capture all of the information, and that's it. It captures all of the information, and then you do the creative work yourself later on. So not all images need the same amount of contrast and saturation and all the rest of it. So having that ability to do that yourself later is massive. And the other thing as well is that because you've captured all this extra information, you can actually fix things like exposure and white balance very, very easily, which I'm now going to show you. So let's open up a RAW file. This is a .cr2 file. Now this is Canon's flavor of RAW file. Most camera manufacturers will have a different file extension. They like to have their own file types for some reason. So for instance, Nikon use .nefs. And then a lot of other camera manufacturers kind of opt in to use .dng, and .dng stands for digital negative, which is kind of how you can think of a RAW file. You know, back in the days of analog film, you take your camera, you take your film out, and then you have to go and get it developed, i.e. edited like a RAW file, and then you end up with your final picture. And that is kind of the process that this is kind of replicating, if you like. So I'm just going to drag and drop this into Photoshop, and maybe just try that again. There we go. And it's going to open up our picture in this dialog box. And this is called Camera Raw 8.6, which is Adobe's kind of Camera Raw editor inside of Photoshop. Now, before I continue, I will just point out that this isn't what I normally use to do this. I actually use a separate piece of software called Adobe Lightroom, which is a dedicated RAW file editor. And the main benefit of that is that you have this kind of library function, so you can organize all your pictures if you're, using this a lot, which I do. But this section of it is absolutely identical to all the settings inside of Lightroom. So don't feel compelled to run out and buy Lightroom. I would argue Lightroom maybe lays it out a little bit better, but how it all works and the mathematics behind what all of these sliders are doing is absolutely identical. Like, it's literally been ripped out of Lightroom and shoved into Photoshop, so you can absolutely get the same results. Now, as I mentioned, this is a slightly underexposed photo, so we can just grab this exposure slider with a RAW file and drag it up. And suddenly we can get a better picture. Now, you would not be able to do that with a JPEG. You would be able to brighten it up to some extent, but there would become a point where the file would degrade quite significantly. And while a RAW file, obviously you can only push a RAW file so far, you can still push it a hell of a lot further than you could a JPEG file. So, if you have kind of been under pressure at an event or something and you've messed up a shot and it's just a little bit too dark or a little bit too bright, you can fix it if you shot it in RAW, and it's massively powerful. The other thing, this picture is a little bit on the warm side, so we can take our color temperature and we can just kind of bring that down a little bit. And this is awesome. I shoot entirely in auto white balance. Gone are the days of having to worry about what camera mode you're on, depending on what room you're in. If you're going from indoors to outdoors, do I have to change it? Do I have to do this? Do I have to do that? No. It is just done. You don't even have to think about it. Because even if the camera gives you a picture that looks like that, which, it does happen, you can fix it. Just no problems. And it's because the white balance isn't kind of baked into a RAW file. It kind of will say, I think it's this, but it's not like a set value, and you can change it entirely after the fact, which you just can't do with a JPEG file. You can change the colors, but it's a much more involved process, and this is way easier. So we've got our exposure and we've got our white balance kind of pretty much set. Now, it still looks very low contrast to me, and that is because RAW files, because they haven't had that contrast or saturation or sharpening added to them in the camera phase, you have to do that yourself. And the way I would like to do that personally is I would normally, you've got kind of 4 tone controls here and then contrast. And you could just go straight for contrast, but I would rather control it a bit more myself. So you've basically got kind of several zones on the histogram. So I would say that this one is blacks, then you have shadows. Midtones is kind of not one you have a slider for. Highlights, and then the white point. So you've got the black point, white point, shadows and highlights. So I would always set the black point first, even though it's kind of at the bottom of the list. And then once you've kind of got the black point to a kind of what you want it to look like, I would take the shadow slider and then put some detail back in. So you still have that kind of black point set, but you can add detail back in where you didn't have it before. Equally with the whites, I would put the white point up to somewhere I was happy with it and then start to bring back in some highlight detail using the highlight slider. And you can kind of push this as much as you kind of want to. Generally speaking, I find with raw editing that kind of less is more. What you don't want to be doing is maxing all of the sliders out to the far edge of everything, because it's going to look overdone. It is a subtlety thing. And really, it's kind of difficult for me to try and sort of show you how to do this in some ways, because you have to feel it out yourself. You have to have a way of editing that works for you, that looks good for your photos. You know, it's like some people, that might be their thing. You know, it's not how I edit my photos, but, you know, there are plenty of people who do stuff completely differently to me, which is fair to say. So maybe you just pump up a little bit extra contrast. Now, on this front tab here, because you've got a whole load of tabs for different stuff you can do, we have one here called Clarity, which is kind of like Sharpening, but not. It's basically edge contrast. So if I just whack this all the way up, you're going to see it gives it a really kind of grungy, weird look. And if you push it all the other way, it kind of softens everything and takes out a lot of contrast on the edges. I generally find that kind of about 25-ish. It depends on the picture. Sometimes more, sometimes less. But kind of something around that just makes everything pop out a little bit more. And then, you know, maybe we could play with some of the colors and saturation and that sort of thing. Maybe we could play with the vibrance a little bit. No, yeah, something like that. Now, you've also got things that you can muck around with a curve if you want to do that. You've got sharpening options under this tab. So cool trick with this one is I normally put the sharpening up quite high, except that the problem you get with this is that it will sharpen every single pixel, and you might not want to do that. So the way I get around that is you can use the masking slider. Now at first this doesn't really appear to be doing much, but let me just try and show you what it is actually doing. If you hold down Alt or Option if you're on the Mac and then click and drag, anything that's white is going to be sharpened, anything that's black is not. So you can kind of bring this up to the point where you're just going to sharpen edges, which is really powerful to be able to do. You can do that inside of Photoshop anyway, but being able to do it at this stage is just awesome. You've also got noise reduction, so I normally put a little bit of noise reduction in. What you don't want to do is put in too much, because it literally will kind of smooth out the picture to the point where it almost looks like an oil painting. You know, maybe that's an effect you want, but I think it's important to kind of keep a little bit of detail in there. It does tend to kind of just blow away detail if you overdo it with the noise reduction. And let's have a look at what else we've got. We can play with the actual individual color channels, so we can pull some of the reds out of it. Maybe we can pump up the oranges, maybe go the other way. Yeah, something like that. Maybe we don't like these blues, so we could come into our hue slider and we could change those to be a completely different color. You know, you've got all sorts of options kind of to play with. Maybe we'd actually like a black and white picture, so we can go convert to grayscale, and then you get this slider here which lets you change the actual kind of black and white value of the colors in the picture. So maybe we can go for something like that. You know, and this is kind of, sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's not. A lot of the time it's good just to leave it. And you've got loads and loads of other options in here, and I would recommend you just have a play with these and see what they do. You've also got some tools up here, so you can do things like spot removal, red eye removal, and loads of other things. And it's probably too much to talk about in one video, but this should give you an introduction to RAW editing and why it is awesome. You just can't do this stuff with a JPEG. Not as easily. I would say that 90% of my edit is done in a RAW editor. A lot of the time, the pictures never even need to go to Photoshop. But when they do, it's better to do it this way. You don't want to be shooting a JPEG file and then limit yourself. The idea with a RAW file is that you take the RAW file and then you save it as a JPEG kind of at the end anyway. So to do that, you can go to Save Image, and it's gone off the bottom of my recording, but you can kind of set up where you want all this stuff to go and JPEG and what you want to do with it. The other option is if you did then need to take this picture and edit it further, do something that you can't necessarily do in a RAW edit, you can go to Open Image, and what it's going to do is it's going to pop it open into Photoshop for us once it's finished reading the RAW format. And there we go, and now we're back into normal everyday Photoshop, and we can kind of edit away and, you know, fix a lot of these problematic little areas. And it's just as easy as that. I genuinely can't stress enough how important it is to shoot RAW. It seems like more work, it genuinely does, but the benefits of doing it this way are going to save you so much heartache. The number of times in the past before I started doing this where I'd have an image that I'd missed the exposure or the white balance was wrong and I couldn't save it and it had to go in the bin, they disappear. You know, you can suddenly, so many more of your images can be saved. And I think that is just about going to do it this time, guys. Maybe I'll revisit this in a little bit more detail. Maybe I'll have a look at Lightroom at some point. But for now, thank you very much for watching. My name is Toby, and we'll see you next time.